So a different way to measure angles, besides degrees, is by radians. Radian measure. So back to, so if we look at on the coordinate plane, and this is 0 degrees, 90, 180, 270, 360 degrees. So a full circle is 360 degrees. Let's think about a basic circle and what we should know from geometry. Circumference of a circle is 2 times pi times the radius. So let's just say it's a radius of 1 to kind of generalize things. The circumference would be 2 pi, right? So this is kind of what we base everything off of. If I have a full circle around, 1 full time is 2 pi. So this is, we start at 0, but in terms of radians, it's 2 pi. So if over to the right is 2 pi, that means at 180 degrees, it would be pi. So halfway around a circle would be pi, which means that 90 would be pi divided by 2. So it's like half pi, pi. So this would be 1.5 or 3 halves pi. 3 pi over 2 is how we usually write it, but it's like 3 halves or 1.5 pi. And then back to make a full circle would be 2 pi. So it's all based on generalizing if it was a radius of 1. So the easiest thing we can do to convert between degrees and radians is to base off of, we're going to base it off of this. 180 and pi are equal. 180 degrees and pi are equal. And the whole point of this is to, if we have to deal with not having a degree unit, to do different kinds of calculations. So as you go into higher math with trigonometry, you're not going to use degrees as often as you're going to use radians. And we'll see pi typically when we deal with radians. Okay, so what we're going to use, like I said, the 180 and the pi. So to convert from degrees to radians is we are going to multiply by pi over 180 degrees. And think of it, it's like we have degrees, we want to cancel out the degrees and be left with radians. And then radians to degrees, we would multiply by 180 degrees over pi. Because it's like we want to be left over with our degree symbol. Okay, so notice, I just want to point out, pi is not a unit, it's a number. This is 3.14. Radians doesn't have a unit. Sometimes we put RAD, which I'll do, but it's not a unit. It's just how far around the circle. You know, like I talked about radius of 1. Well, if it was like 1 inch, the circumference of a circle that is 1 inch is 2 pi inches, which is 6.28 inches would be the radius of a circle with a radius of 1 inch. Okay, so let's do some examples with this. I'll go back to that the coordinate system as well. So let's do one we already had up there. How about 270 degrees, and we want to change this to radians. So if I take 270 degrees and I multiply by pi over 180 degrees, so that degrees cancels. I'm just going to do some reducing. Reduce by 10 would cancel out the 0. Reduce by 9, I'd be left with 3 and 2. So notice I get 3 pi over 2. Okay, or how about, how about 60 degrees? Again, times pi over 180. So think about 60 degrees would be about here. Remember, this is 0, this is pi. So let's see what we end up with. Same thing, if I cancel this, reduce by 10, cancel the zeros, reduce by 6, I'll be left with pi over 3. So that's like 1/3 of the way to pi, which looks about right. If I cut right here, this would be pi over 3. This would be 2/3 of the way up to pi. So that sounds about right. Now I want to point out too, this is, what would this be about? Pi divided by 3, it's going to be about 1.047. So, you know, this is kind of a reference again. Pi is 3.14, 2 pi is 6.28. So this is saying how far around the circle I am. 1.047 around the circle versus 6.28 being the full time around. Okay. How about, let's go the other way. So that was degrees to radians. Let's see. Let's do, how about 5 pi over 6 to degrees. And let's kind of think about this. Again, if this is pi, 5 pi over 6 should be somewhere over here. So let's see if it makes sense when I get my degrees. So 5 pi over 6 times 180 over pi. So the pi's are going to cancel. 6 will cancel. 6 divided, 180 divided by 6 is 30. So 5 times 30 would be 150 degrees. And that makes sense because if 180 in pi is a full straight line, that sounds about right that that'd be 150. Okay, how about 3.5 radians? Just 3.5 to degrees. Notice, it's just 3.5. There's no unit. Like I said, sometimes you might say like radians or see RAD, but this is just a number. So this is saying around the circle, this was 3.14, so it should just be a little over 180. So let's see what we get. 3.5 times 180 divided by pi. Okay, this one, nothing really to reduce, it's more of a plug in the calculator. 3.5 times 180 divided by pi is 200.5 degrees. 200.5 degrees, which makes sense. We said it's just going to be a little more than 180 degrees.